Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 107 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In May 1787, a convention convened in Philadelphia with the goal of discussing, revising, and redrafting the government of the United States. We know the second American Constitution that came out of that convention as the Constitution of 1787. And when politicians, lawyers, and historians discuss the Constitution, how it was drafted, and the intent of the founders, they often rely on two documents: the Federalist Papers, which is a collection of promotional tracts written to convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution, and James Madison's Notes on the Convention, which he took during the convention's proceedings between May and September 1787. But what do we really know about Madison's Notes? Yes, they capture a lot of information about the convention's proceedings, but did Madison draft them to serve as a definitive account of the event for posterity? Today, we investigate James Madison's Notes on the Constitutional Convention with award-winning legal historian Mary Sarah Bilder, author of Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention. During our investigation, Mary reveals details about the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and James Madison's views on government, why Madison took notes of the convention's proceedings, and how Madison used his notes during and after the convention. But first, are you a subscriber to the Franklin Gazette? The Franklin Gazette is a weekly email newsletter that places the show notes for each and every episode right in your inbox. This means that even when you listen to Ben Franklin's World on the go, which is how I listen to my podcasts, you can reference and remind yourself of the links, books, historic sites, and interesting information we talked about on the show when you have the leisure time in front of your phone, tablet, or computer to do so. Subscribing to the Franklin Gazette is free and easy. All you need to do is take out your smartphone and text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen. Are you ready to travel back in time and explore the Constitutional Convention through James Madison's notes? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is the Founders Professor of Law at Boston College. She researches the history of judicial review and colonial and founding era constitutionalism. She's the author of 4 books, including, most recently, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, which won the 2016 Bancroft Prize and the 2015 James Bradford Best Biography Prize presented by the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Mary Sarah Bilder.
Thanks so much, Liz, for having me today.
In Madison's Hand, Mary explores the history of James Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Mary, would you set the scene for us? Would you provide us with an overview of the Constitutional Convention?
The Constitutional Convention was the meeting that wrote our Constitution, what I tend to sometimes call the 1787 Constitution. It was filled with famous people like George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They met to rewrite the Constitution because the earlier document, the Articles of Confederation, wasn't working. After the Revolution, they needed to rethink the type of government they were having, and so in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, delegates were sent to try and write a new document for the new United States.
Today we know the Constitutional Convention as one of the most important meetings in United States history, and I wonder, did Americans at the time understand the importance that this meeting would have?
Excellent question, and one that I'm actually working on now because I'm reading all the newspapers for that summer. So ordinary Americans knew there was a convention. White men had participated in electing the representatives to that convention. They knew that they were going to try and solve some of the problems that the United States was facing, particularly financial problems and problems with trying to think about commercial regulation. They weren't able to follow the convention on a day-to-day basis. People didn't obviously have things like television or radio. They did have newspapers, but the convention made a decision early on to close its proceedings. So no one was allowed to sort of listen in on a daily basis. And that actually wasn't unusual. All legislative proceedings were closed, but it meant that people outside didn't really know on a daily basis what decisions were actually being made.
That seems really weird, because today we can tune into C-SPAN and watch all of the debates. It's kind of hard to imagine a world where you have no idea what your representatives in government are doing.
Yeah, it was actually more the norm than I think we sometimes realize. Many of the state legislatures allowed people in the galleries just on occasion. The colonists had been used to being shut out of Parliament, which allowed people in on an occasional basis, because when debates about the American colonies were being conducted, people were sent from the galleries. No one could listen. It's not even unusual in the new government. After the Constitution, when the House of Representatives is formed, they will open their doors and have people able to watch and reporters able to watch. But the Senate for the first couple of years actually is closed. And only when the public begins to demand more access does the Senate decide that it will also allow people to come and listen. So the notion we have of government is not the notion that really was right there in 1787, 1788, 89.
What interest did James Madison have in the Constitutional Convention, and why did Virginia elect him as one of their deputies?
Well, Madison was part of a group of Virginians who desperately wanted the government to have more power. The most significant of these Virginians was George Washington. George Washington worried that the military wasn't being able to be paid, that European nations were disrespecting the United States, and that they wouldn't be able to raise money to finance growing commerce. So George Washington and Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, and James Madison were among a group of people in the United States who wanted to have a new type of government. They particularly wanted a government that would give more national control over the states. And Madison had attended a meeting in Annapolis that attempted to write a new government. That failed completely, but he's the person who's very involved in the idea of getting Congress to put out a call for a new convention, and then he writes the legislation in Virginia to elect delegates, and then he gets himself elected.
So we get why George Washington was frustrated with the government. He was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and the Confederation government couldn't adequately supply and pay his men. But how did Madison come to the idea that the United States needed a stronger government than the Articles of Confederation could provide?
Yeah, well, Madison in the 1780s isn't James Madison as we know him. He isn't obviously president. He hasn't been elected to Congress. He's a member of the Confederation Congress, the Congress that exists prior to the Constitution. James Madison wanted to be an important person, but he wasn't yet an important person. One of the things that was very frustrating to him was he didn't agree with many Virginia politicians, particularly, for example, Patrick Henry or Richard Henry Lee. They tended to think of Virginia and Virginia interests as important. Madison wanted a bigger stage. He was thinking of national interests. So for Madison, the idea of writing a new document is a way of also escaping the Virginia politics that he didn't really like very much.
In Madison's hand, Mary notes that Madison kept his notes of convention proceedings in the style of a legislative journal. Mary, would you tell us what a legislative journal was in the late 18th century and about Madison's note-taking practices?
One of the things that was very interesting to me when I started my project was we actually don't have a word on the American history side for what to call people who took notes of legislative proceedings. The British have a word. They call it a parliamentary diary. And I borrowed that word for my book, so I call it a legislative diary. It was different from what we expect. Today, the congressional record takes almost verbatim record of what happens on the floor, and you can obviously also watch it on C-SPAN. In those days, nothing like that existed. And so in the book, I talk about how people who were members of state legislatures, but particularly the Confederation Congress, took notes so they could remember what had happened themselves. Madison took notes like that when he was a member of the Confederation Congress. And those notes were important to him for two reasons. First, they helped him remember what other politicians thought so he could build coalitions. But secondly, they allowed him to transfer that information to people who couldn't be there. And one of the most significant readers of his congressional notes was Thomas Jefferson.
So, Madison's notes were really for personal use and to share with a friend. They weren't necessarily meant for the public eye.
No, I don't think they were meant initially at all for the public eye. They were thought of as personal diaries, political diaries, strategy diaries. That isn't to say that Madison, as a young man, might not have thought, perhaps one day I'll be famous and people will be interested in this, but that wasn't his primary purpose. And you can tell that when he went to Congress before 1787, because he writes only about matters that concerned him, and he also writes about matters that concern Thomas Jefferson. So it's a political diary in a way that we don't tend to think people keep any longer.
Was Madison unique in that he kept a legislative diary, or did other members also keep diaries of the convention proceedings as well?
Well, many people took notes. Madison's notes aren't the only ones. His will become famous because they will end up being the only ones that cover every day. But Rufus King took notes, Alexander Hamilton took some notes, William Pierce took some notes, John Lansing took notes. So other people took notes. It's just that Madison's become very famous because there's notes for every day of the convention.
One of the aspects of Madison's hand that I really enjoyed was how you talked about the physicality of his notes. And I wonder if you would tell us what his notes look like and about Madison's handwriting and what that looks like.
One of the most exciting parts of the project was getting to work with the Library of Congress staff. At the beginning of the project, the Library of Congress staff, I think, understandably thought I was kind of a crazy person to suggest, well, I really need to see this incredibly important document because I think it might have been written in two different moments. You just can't walk into the Library of Congress and say that and then have them show you. So after I did quite a bit of work and wrote a number of documents for the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress decided that I was at least sufficiently serious and did need a certain amount of access. So the Library of Congress let me into their conservation lab, and together with the library staff, we looked at the notes. You can see the notes on the web. The Library of Congress has a wonderful website, and they have images of the notes. What's different in person is that the pages are very small, so the notes themselves are approximately just a little bit bigger than if you took a 9 by 11 piece of paper and swung it horizontally. They're written on 4 sides, so Madison took each piece of paper and he folded it sort of in half like a little book, and then he wrote on the first side, he opened up, he wrote the second side, the third side, and then the last side. And Madison has very neat handwriting. Reading his writing is exceptionally easy. He wrote in a style of italic handwriting that doesn't cause problems for historians. What was always fascinating to me was he wrote incredibly precisely. I found myself, after many weeks of taking notes on his handwriting, some of my letters begin to look like Madison's. I had spent so much time reading his handwriting. And so it's just a very specific style of writing. And the Library of Congress has disassembled the notes, so each page is separately kept between mylar. And then the notes themselves are, in preservation boxes. And then those are inside a vault in the library. So the library considers the notes one of its top treasures held in trust for the American people.
What were you able to see by looking at the actual physical notes that we can't see by looking at the digitized copies? Or I guess another way of asking this is, how did you benefit from being able to use the original copies versus just the digitized version?
One thing that was very important for my project was being able to look at the watermarks. Watermarks don't prove anything. There might be many reasons why people might use the same or different pieces of paper. But together with textual evidence, they can begin to help one reconstruct the story of how some manuscript got written. So for my purposes, it was very important to be able to figure out, was there a pattern to the watermarks? One of the things the library did before they gave me access was they agreed to shoot some digital photographs of the watermarks. Digital photography has really changed or revolutionized the study of watermarks. Prior to digital photography, in order to get an image of a watermark, you either had to draw it by hand, which is quite difficult. I've tried that. Or you had to use a special camera and a special type of paper. Digital photography means anybody with any kind of camera can take a picture of a piece of the manuscript on a light table with the light shining through it. And the library took about, somewhere between 10 and 15 of those images of selected pages. That then allowed me to develop a pattern of watermarks. And then what the library and I did was we put every page of the manuscript on a light table. What you could see then was that most of the manuscript, the first 2/3 of the manuscript, was almost all the same watermark, with a couple notable exceptions. But the last thirds of the manuscript was a completely different type of watermark. And that fit with the other types of textual evidence that I was developing. Another thing that I didn't expect to see, but turned out to be wonderful, was I argue in my book that the manuscript after August 21st was written later. Well, when we looked at the August 21st page of the manuscript compared to the August 22nd page of the manuscript, you could see that the holes in the margins used to sew those two sections together didn't align. And that also went to bolster my argument that the last part of the manuscript had been separate, that it had been not written at the same moment as the first part of the manuscript. Sewn holes aren't something we normally think to look at, and you can't see them on microfilm very easily. Even digital images make it hard, and that's where really being able to see the manuscript was just wonderful.
Wow. It sounds like the Library of Congress librarians and archivists really helped you make your case.
They were wonderful people, and without them, the ability to do this project would have been impossible. They were also really funny. I was there once and I had a terrible cold. I never touched the manuscript. They used it, but they gave me a lot of Kleenex one day so that I wasn't sneezing on Madison's Notes.
I'm curious about your argument. You said you walked into the Library of Congress with this crazy idea that Madison's notes were actually written in two phases during the summer of 1787, and that he probably wrote the last third of his notes sometime after fall 1789. And it seems like the watermarks on the paper helped you prove your case. But what is the significance of Madison's having written his notes at different times, with that last third having been added almost 2 years later?
Well, first of all, it tells us something very important about the convention. It reminds us that Madison wasn't sitting there taking notes for posterity for us. He was actually involved in the convention. He cared about what happened. So one important thing is that the shift when he abandons the note-taking in August corresponds with when he became sick, but also when he began to serve on many committees. And so one important thing that the division reminds us is that by the end of the convention, the delegates were so busy trying to figure out the last pieces of the Constitution that they didn't really have the ability to sit back and think about what did the whole thing look like. They were madly trying to get it together. And so the book argues that they couldn't really see the Constitution in the way that we see it. They were just trying to finish it up. And it reminds us of how complicated the story of writing it was by the end of the convention. So that's one very important thing. A second very important thing is that the part of the convention that's interesting to constitutional historians and law professors has often been the last third. That's when many of the decisions about things that interest modern constitutional historians were made. The first 2/3 of the convention mostly sorted out what the balance between the states and national government would be. But it's in the last third of the convention that many of the details were added. So when we say that, well, that part, the record of that wasn't written until 2 years later, that makes it much more difficult to figure out how did anybody at the moment understand those changes.
This raises two questions for us. One, why did Madison feel like he needed to go back and finish his notes after the Constitution had already been ratified? And two, how did he reconstruct what happened for his notes almost 2 years later? Did Madison have an incredible memory?
Well, I argue in the book that Madison kept the notes largely for himself and for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was in France, serving as the congressional ambassador in France. And in 1789, Madison learned that Jefferson was returning. I argue that Madison wanted Jefferson to be able to read about the Constitution. Jefferson had missed the convention. And unlike John Adams, who had come back in time for ratification, Jefferson had sort of missed the whole party. If you know the Hamilton musical, they start off the second act with Jefferson's return. So Jefferson's return to the United States in 1789 is very important. And Madison goes back at that moment and tries to finish the manuscript off. If you think about Madison in in September of 1787, when the convention ended, he didn't even know that the Constitution would be sent out to the states for Congress. He didn't know that the Constitution would be ratified. So there's no reason to finish the notes then. But in 1789, the Constitution was ratified. Congress has already started. Madison's serving in Congress. Thomas Jefferson's coming back. He's going to serve as Secretary of State. Madison knows that amendments are being written for the Constitution. Suddenly, the convention is important, and Madison wants to give that record to Thomas Jefferson. I argue in the notes that Madison acquired the journal of the convention from George Washington. There had been a journal kept by the Secretary of the Convention. At the end of the convention, it had been given to Washington, and Washington's instructions were a little unclear what he was supposed to do with it, but he probably wasn't supposed to lend it to James Madison. Washington's diaries for the months that he probably lent it don't exist. So we don't know how Madison got his hands on the journal. Madison got his hands on the official journal. He made a copy of that journal. That copy is at Yale University in the Beinecke Library. He started his copy with the August section of the journal, suggesting that he didn't think he had very much time to copy. So he was originally just copying the part that he didn't have his notes for. He then went back and copied the entire official journal. And I argue in the book that Madison then took this copy of the official journal. He took whatever scraps of paper he had of rough notes from 2 years ago, and he wrote the last third of the convention notes.
So Madison had kind of like two cheat sheets. He had the official journal of the convention, at least we think he did, and his rough notes.
Right. I'm quite sure he had the official journal, a copy of the official journal, because you can show that in the last third of the manuscript, what we've tended to think of as Madison's notes are actually verbatim or loosely paraphrased copy of the actual journal. And there's words that appear in this section that are sort of used by the official secretary that Madison had never used that suddenly appear. Constitutional law professors have tended to think, oh, this means Madison's very interested in the text, in the procedure, in the last third of the convention. My book argues, well, he wrote that 2 years later, and the appearance of focus on text is largely because he was copying the official journal.
You brought up the fact that Madison had rough notes. What are rough notes? Are they not just his notes?
Yeah, one thing that I think that American historians have maybe not been as interested in exploring as medievalists or English historians is that many of the manuscripts we have are what we would call a fair copy, F-A-I-R. And a fair copy is the words used to describe a clean copy. Often what people did was they wrote a rough copy of something, and then they copied that over. And the manuscript that we have is the fair copy, in essence, the second copy. I believe that what Madison did that summer was, after the first days, which I think were actually contemporaneously taken, he took rough notes. That is, he scribbled things down during the proceedings using sort of casual abbreviations. And then twice a week, probably on Wednesdays and Sundays, he took those rough notes and he wrote up what had happened during the week into this fair copy. And the fair copy is what we actually have today as the manuscript. And what that means is that for all of the days in the notes, not just the ones that were revised 2 years later, Madison was always writing with some knowledge of what had happened. That is, the notes were always retrospective. They weren't really contemporaneous in the way that we might think somebody who was just scribbling at the time. There is no example that I know of Madison's rough notes. They've either never been found or he destroyed them as he made his rough copy. And that's not surprising. Very few of us keep our rough drafts around. Most of us copy them over and then throw them out.
So if we don't have Madison's rough notes to look at, how do we know they existed?
We don't know for sure, but that's the argument that I make in the book. And I make that argument because there's examples in a few places where Madison refers to things that happened after the moment that he was taking the notes. So you know he's writing in sort of retrospect. And I argue because of the very strong pattern in the notes, one of the things that's distinctive about the notes is that every speaker, the speeches all begin with a topic sentence making the major point of the speech. And you can't do that if you're contemporaneously taking notes, and almost nobody speaks like that. So basically, Madison imposed this sense of order on the notes. This was actually a great stylistic thing to do. And when I wrote my book, I actually imitated it. So you can read Madison's notes by reading the first sentence of every paragraph and get a pretty good idea of what's going on. And you can read my book by reading the first sentence of every paragraph and get a pretty good idea of what's going on.
If Madison used this two-note system, where he's taking notes contemporaneously, likely with a shorthand while the convention meets, and then 2 days a week going through and making his fair copy, he must have had ample opportunities to revise the information that we see in the fair copy.
Right, that's precisely correct. So in a sense, there's always distance in the notes between the actual convention and the record of the convention. And what was interesting to me is the distance changes at different moments. So one pattern you can see in the notes is that people who spoke on Saturday often speak the longest. I argue in the book that's because Madison had all of Sunday to write his rough notes up. And what had happened was very close. So he had a pretty good memory of what happened. So if you track the long speeches, they are disproportionately Saturday speeches. So Madison always was able to write with hindsight. With respect to Madison's speeches, this is a fascinating issue. Madison obviously couldn't talk and take notes at the same time. He didn't read a prepared text the way James Wilson did for Benjamin Franklin. So when he wrote his own speeches, he wrote them after the fact. We would all like to think that we spoke more eloquently, more coherently, more logically than we did at the time. And an interesting thing is if you compare Madison's speeches that other note takers heard to Madison's speeches as he reported it, they often don't sound exactly like the same speech. Other people, for example, often have Madison speaking in a kind of wandering fashion, but Madison tends to write his own speeches as if he were extremely logical.
And this goes back to your point that the notes were actually composed as a personal document for his own self-reference and for the reference of Thomas Jefferson. We've talked a lot about the physicality of the notes and the process that Madison used to take them. But I also have to believe that the content of the notes reflect and reveal a lot about Madison's interest in the convention. Did Madison have particular interests in certain subjects, speeches, people, or viewpoints that kept reappearing in his notes?
What I was fascinated by is that when you try and go back and, in essence, uncover what did the notes look like as Madison was writing them, and we imagine this as what does that tell us about who Madison was in May and June and July of 1787, we find a different Madison. The Madison that historians have tended to write about is moderate, rational, the father of federalism, a sort of impartial person. The Madison that I found is irritated at people, catty, obsessed with pushing an agenda that he cared about. So this is a very different personality. One of the things that he cared, I believe, immensely about was he wanted the new government to have proportional representation in both houses. That is, he wanted proportional representation in the House of Representatives. That's the system we have today. But he also wanted it in the Senate. The thing he wanted to destroy was the idea that the states were equally represented. Now, that's the system that we come to have in the Senate. And so to find that Madison not only didn't agree with it, but he was obsessed with trying to make sure it wouldn't end up in the new government was fascinating. For most of June and into mid-July, all Madison cares about is limiting the state's power and trying to destroy equal state suffrage. That's a very different story than the one that we've often understood about the convention. I think another story that is different than the story that historians have told is Madison's attitude towards slavery. This was perhaps one of the parts of the book that I care most about. For reasons that are probably complicated, James Madison has been given sort of a pass on the slavery question. People haven't really focused on what was Madison's relationship to slavery in the same way that they focused on Jefferson or Washington. Madison was not an abolitionist, and he wasn't really even an anti-slavery guy. In fact, Madison would never free anyone held as an enslaved person at the time of his death. Madison was the author, or at least thought to be responsible for the original Three-Fifths Clause when it was used in the Confederation Congress. And the story I tell in my book is one in which Madison himself bears quite a bit of responsibility for getting the Three-Fifths Clause into the Constitution and for, in essence, creating the dynamic in which the Southern states believed that they had to protect slavery. This isn't to say that slavery wouldn't have been protected in the Constitution, but in writing my book, I came to believe that Madison himself was far more personally responsible for the creation of that dynamic than historians have thought.
That's really interesting. Would you tell us more about the history of the Three-Fifths Clause and Madison's involvement with its creation? Why did he settle on 3/5?
Well, the Three-Fifths Clause, which is one of the parts of the Constitution that is fortunately, in essence, repealed by the 13th and 14th Amendments, was the part of the Constitution that said that 3 white people equaled 5 African Americans. And what that meant was that states would be given voting power for every 5 African Americans that were enslaved, as if they were 3 white people. But of course, the 5 enslaved African Americans wouldn't vote. So what the Three-Fifths Clause actually does was it gave additional power to states that had slavery. And it did that by, of course, ensuring that those states would have even more representatives in Congress. Originally, Madison proposes this, or is part of the group of people who propose it in 1783, as part of a way to try and think of raising revenue for, we might think of like taxes. But he then uses it again in the convention as a way of thinking about political power. I argue in the book that Madison wanted the Senate to be proportional representation. And as he begins to lose that fight, he looks for political allies. And he tries to put together a coalition that would have the 3 large states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, who would be benefited by a Senate based on population, with the 3 slave states, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, who would similarly be benefited based on power given to representation based on population. And Madison tries to argue that if those 2 groups come together, that's 6 states, they can outvote the 5 states. So he argues proportional representation will benefit large states and slave states. In doing this, he puts forth this distinction that's a sectional distinction. And Governor Morris gives an enormous speech arguing that he had thought this was a heretical suggestion, but now that it was out there, they would have to deal with it. And so in some ways, Madison creates, or at least states in a very explicit way to the Southern states, that they need to protect their slavery interests in the national government.
This really illustrates that Madison had big Southern state ideas and that he tried to push them through the convention.
Right. And if we sometimes forget what Virginia looks like, Virginia was a lot bigger in 1787 than it is today. It included Kentucky, which was basically in the process of being spun off, and of course West Virginia, which is divided at the time of the Civil War. And Virginia had almost 300,000 people enslaved. Virginia holds in slavery almost half the entire enslaved population in the United States. If Virginia had been allowed to count all of the enslaved persons in the state into their political power, they would vastly control the United States. I mean, everybody would have had to put together a coalition to have balanced that amount of political power. So an interesting dynamic at the convention is Madison doesn't think of himself as a Virginian. He doesn't like Patrick Henry. He doesn't like Richard Henry Lee. He thinks of himself in some ways as a nationalist, but when he gets up to speak, other delegates hear him as a Virginian, as somebody whose political preferences are going to give Virginia enormous political power in the new government. One thing that you can see is people keep calculating how many delegates in Congress Virginia's going to get. And every time Virginia ends up on the top. Madison doesn't understand this, but to others, every time Madison speaks, he's speaking about a world in which Virginia interests like slavery, like control of the Mississippi, like an agricultural over commercial economy are going to dominate the new government.
We've talked a lot about the ways that Madison took his notes, and I'd like to turn now to his uses of his notes. When Madison was going after his agenda of proportional representation in 2 different houses, adding the Three-Fifths Clause into the Constitution, and his other big Southern state ideas, did he have any strategic advantage by keeping his notes? Did his notes allow him to develop any sort of strategies that he might have applied within the convention?
Oh, that's a wonderful point. Yes, he did. He was able to use his notes to pick apart delegations. Many of the people who he records in his notes, I argue he's recording as a way of remembering what they cared about. And so he's able to start counting individual votes. An interesting thing at the convention is that the delegations had 1 vote per state. And that vote was determined by the majority within the delegation. So when Madison's able to, for example, know how the Massachusetts delegates feel individually by looking back at his notes, he's able to think about how can he break up that coalition? How can he make arguments that will divide that group of people so that the state either doesn't vote or their vote goes the way he wants? So it's a very sophisticated mechanism for him. And there are moments in July where he seems to be referring back to votes that he had recorded earlier.
Did Madison actually talk about this strategy in his notes, or are his actions just something we're able to infer from the way that the convention turned out?
No, there is 1 or 2 examples, I believe, where he specifically refers to how a state had voted in the past. The secretary kept the motions and he also kept the votes, but every member didn't have a record of those votes. So Madison's record is very useful to him.
Did Madison ever use his notes after the Constitutional Convention ended? Chris would like to know if he used his notes to write his portion of the Federalist Papers, and David would like to know if Madison's notes influenced his participation in the Virginia Ratifying Convention or in the Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1829-1830.
Those are both great questions. Madison in 1788 begins to participate in Alexander Hamilton's writing of the Federalist Papers. And Alexander Hamilton came up with the plan, and he eventually asks James Madison to help him write these essays for newspapers in New York to help influence the New York ratification contest. And Madison, because he was a Virginian, probably knew they would also be used to influence the Virginia ratification convention. Madison seems to have occasionally used his notes, but I suggest that one of the things that writing the Federalist essays did was it gave him a perspective on the convention. Alexander Hamilton had been at the convention, but he'd missed a whole lot of days. So when Alexander Hamilton wrote his Federalist essays, he was arguing about the Constitution the way all of us might argue about the Constitution. That is, what did we think it should mean? Not what had somebody at the time said it meant. And Madison, over the course of writing the Federalist essays, seems to almost be freed a little bit from the convention. He starts making arguments up a little bit to try and counter claims made about the Constitution. 2 claims that had become very pervasive that worried Madison after the Constitution had been completed in September of 1787 were 1, that the convention had tried to abolish the states, or 2, that the convention had been creating a monarchical government under the guise of this new government. The Articles of Confederation government hadn't had a president. And so to some people, the fact that the new government would have a president looked suspiciously similar to a monarch. It's hard for us to imagine that because we think of the president as someone you just have to have. But in 1787, the idea of having a president was still quite new. So Madison doesn't rely specifically on his notes as much as he sort of reimagines certain possibilities about the convention. In the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Madison doesn't rely, again, specifically on his notes, but he implies that he knows what happens almost as if he had notes. So he gives himself legitimacy, but Madison again sort of tries to make arguments that will be persuasive to the people in the room. One interesting thing about Madison at the Virginia Ratifying Convention is Madison seeks to reassure Virginians who own people that they will be allowed to continue to own people in the new government. So at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Madison is very careful to suggest that the Constitution doesn't give the national government any power to abolish slavery or do anything really to touch slavery.
Earlier, Mary noted that one of the reasons Madison took his notes was so that he could share them with his friend Thomas Jefferson, who was then serving in France. In Madison's hand, she notes that Jefferson returned to the United States and came to the new Constitution as a reader. Mary, what did it mean for Jefferson to come to the Constitution as a reader? And what role did Madison's notes play in Jefferson's conception of American constitutionalism?
We have often thought of the relationship between Madison and Jefferson as a collaboration, as a great collaboration, and that's the name of Adrian Koch's famous book on Madison and Jefferson. One of the things that's fascinating about the story that I followed was thinking about how did Jefferson learn about the Constitution. He hadn't participated in the convention. He hadn't participated in the ratification debates. So what did he think the Constitution meant when he read the convention the way Madison recorded it? One thing that really, I think, became clear to Jefferson, although it was a somewhat inaccurate depiction, was Jefferson came to believe that Alexander Hamilton had wanted to create a monarchical government. Jefferson probably came to believe this because he read a speech that Hamilton gave in June. I argue in the book that Hamilton gave this speech in June, arguing for a sort of super powerful national government with a president on lifetime tenure as a way of persuading people that the actual plan wasn't all that powerful. That is, he was making up a plan so that the plan that was going forward would look like it was a moderate plan. Alexander Hamilton might have been sort of secretly thinking this would be a good idea, but he never actually introduced his plan. Jefferson, however, would have read the plan as if it really represented what Hamilton secretly believed. And so one thing that I believe happens because of Jefferson's reading of the notes is it's the beginning of Jefferson's obsession with Alexander Hamilton. The book tracks Jefferson's increased sense that Hamilton is secretly trying to create a monarchy. And Jefferson always cites to Hamilton at the convention as the beginning of this. So the book really tells the story of their disagreement as located in Madison's notes.
Before we move into the time warp, I'm curious about one more thing. In Madison's hand, Mary states that she wants to show the importance of reading a primary source document like Madison's notes with consideration of context, genre, audience, and subsequent provenance. Mary, what does reading Madison's notes, in light of all these considerations, tell us about the document? And how does reading his notes while keeping all these considerations in mind add to or change what we know about the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention and the intent of the Founding Fathers?
I think American historians have tended to approach the documents left to us by the framing generation as if they were somehow great pieces of political philosophy handed down by someone like Aristotle. What the book tries to argue is that the framers were people. They were people like us. They had great strengths and they also had terrible weaknesses. When we think about the notes as a document, as a text that's being created in a certain political moment, I think that gives us both greater respect for what was accomplished, but also an ability to think hard about how we might feel today about those decisions. It reminds us they were ordinary people, even if 225 years later, we usually see them only as statues.
And now for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Thomas Jefferson had been in the United States during the Constitutional Convention? Would he have served as one of Virginia's delegates? And if so, how would his presence at the convention have changed Madison's notes?
Oh, what a fun question. Jefferson definitely would have been elected to the convention, and he would have gone. It would have completely altered the approach, and it would have altered all of American history. Jefferson had a different approach to constitutionalism. He often tended to get himself all caught up on theoretical issues. So we might have seen more discussion about theory at the convention than people might have experienced now. But a lot of the people at the convention were sort of pragmatic politicians, and Jefferson tended to be a lot more interested in political philosophy. And if we were to add John Adams being there, for example, we're both interested in the way Europeans thought about constitutions. And so had they both been there, we might have had long discourses on European constitutionalism. The people who were there were, again, mostly pragmatic, and they just wanted to write a document. So although we have some interesting discussions of political theory, they're not as long. I think most importantly, Jefferson would have been a participant in the convention and the Constitution, and he would have been less likely to try and undercut it when he became president. So one thing I talk about in the book is how Jefferson's a little bit of an outsider to the Constitution and the convention, and he often argues in the years that after his return against the Constitution to limit it. He's not comfortable with it the way people who helped write it were comfortable with it. If Jefferson had been there, he would have had a stake in the Constitution, and his whole presidency probably would have been different. The 1790s might never have happened if he and Hamilton and Madison and Washington had all been on the same side. So if we move Jefferson back to Philadelphia, all of American history probably becomes different.
At the start of our conversation, you mentioned that you were researching how Americans understood the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Is that the topic of your next book?
One of the things that I have become very interested in, particularly this summer, a summer where we've seen the political election going on before our eyes with people not sure which way the American political election is going to go down, where we watched the Brexit vote with people not sure which way the Brexit vote was going to happen, was how does it feel for people to live in a moment of political uncertainty? I'm really interested in what did it feel like in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to people outside the convention watching the convention. I want to write a book that sort of does a better job of answering your first question, which was sort of what was it like to be outside the convention? One thing that really interests me about Philadelphia in 1787 was that people don't know what's going to happen. One of the things that is most interesting about being a historian is trying to get back to the moment where they don't know what's going to happen. We always know what's going to happen. One thing that's very hard for American historians is we so know what happens, we so know the story, that we have a hard time hearing the ways in which the story could have happened differently, the contingency in all of it. So I'd like to write about the convention from outside the convention. I'd also like to write about women and African Americans who were in Philadelphia that summer and how they might have imagined the convention of the new government might have involved them.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and where we can contact you if we still have questions about James Madison and the Constitutional Convention?
Well, I'm happy to answer emails, and so you can write me at Boston College Law School by email. I have a website there, and there's also a website at Harvard University Press, and you can get the book itself online at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, at independent bookstores. It's on Nook, Kindle, and should be soon at the iTunes store.
Mary Sarah Bilder, thank you so much for taking us through Madison's notes and how they were created.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
We have a hard time hearing how the story could have happened differently. Mary's point about how we in the 21st century know how the history of early America turns out is a really important one. If we fail to acknowledge that we know what happens next, then we'll ignore the context our historical records, like Madison's notes, were created in. And that leaves us open to infusing these sources with all our own viewpoints and ideas, which ultimately means we'll misread and misinterpret the past. So when we study the past, we need to suspend our knowledge of what comes next, so that we can better understand how people who lived during the time or event we're studying understood that time and how that event unfolded. This is hard work, and as we heard, Mary went to great lengths to try and understand the notes Madison took during the Constitutional Convention so that she could better understand how and why Madison took those notes and what he recorded in them. Mary's research reveals that Madison did not take his notes to be a definitive historical account of the Constitutional Convention. When he started taking his notes, he took them so that he could remember and process what he had heard, figure out who he wanted to debate against and form alliances with, and so he could keep his friend Thomas Jefferson apprised of what was going on. In 1787, Madison had no idea that the Constitution would turn out the way that it did, that the states would ratify the government, or that the government he helped to create would still be in effect over 225 years later. In fact, as Mary's Watermark and Sewing Hole research reveal, Madison didn't even complete his notes until almost 2 years after the convention, when it became clear that the new government would actually go into effect. When we consider the intent of the founders and other people who came before us, we must consider the intent they put into the records they created and left behind for us to read. Madison wanted a government that supported slavery and privileged Virginia and other large southern states. How would he see this goal through? These were the ideas Madison had in mind when he took his notes. His notes helped him think through the convention's debates and to note different techniques and strategies that he might use to affect the outcomes he sought. You can find more information about Mary, her award-winning book, Madison's Hand, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/107. The holidays are coming. I know, it sounds too soon, and it kind of feels too soon too, but I kid you not, Thanksgiving is only 2 weeks away. As you start to think about your holiday gift lists, remember that you can purchase books we discuss on the podcast through the Ben Franklin's World website and app. When you click on a link to a book on the website or in the app, and then purchase that book through Amazon, Amazon sends the show a bit of money as a commission. And these commission funds help keep the podcast going. Okay, what did you think of Mary's revelation that James Madison helped author and advocate for the Three-Fifths Clause? Does this revelation change your views of James Madison? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.